Without doubt, Banks was a wealthy private individual, a collector and traveler par excellence. But Banks, the scientist, collected for a purpose in the pursuit of philosophical inquiry, and through observation and its application, the advancement of knowledge and order. At Kew, he was by proxy the architect and manager of a matchless living collection of plants. But here too, his collection on behalf of the king had a vision and a purpose. Banks knew exactly what he wished to achieve there. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the history of fresh produce. And that is a passage from the book, The Multifarious Mr. Banks by Toby Musgrave. We've had a lot of books on Mr. Banks in this series, and there's certainly no shortage of it. And today, Patrick, we're back with episode 6 of our long, winding, plant-filled journey through the life of Joseph Banks. And if the earlier episodes were about adventure, which a lot of them were, right? We went to Tahiti on the Endeavor, the thrill of discovery in Australia.
Yep.
Then this one is going to be about something far quieter, but arguably, I would say, far more powerful, because this is the moment Banks stops being just a collector of plants and really becomes an architect of botanical empire.
Yes, you are right. And fewer waves crashing over the bow, more quiet walks through gardens with the king.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, yeah, fewer storms at sea, more murmured conversations among beds of exotic shrubs. And the setting, of course, for all of this is Kew Gardens, or rather what Kew becomes under Banks's influence. Because by the end of Banks's life, under his partnership with his BFF, King George III, something like 7,000 new plant species had been introduced into Britain. And that number alone just tells you this wasn't gardening as a genteel hobby, right? I mean, this was infrastructure, this was policy, this was economics, science, and power braided together through roots and seeds. And Banks himself put it very plainly. He wants a Kew to be, in his words, quote, a great botanical exchange house for the empire.
Which is a wonderfully revealing phrase, isn't it, John? Not a sanctuary, not a museum, an exchange house.
Yeah, I mean, plants as currency, right? Plants as assets. Like,
100%.
think of it as your stock portfolio, but just living things. So yeah, I mean, these were plants as tools for reshaping landscapes and diets and entire colonial economies. Now, of course, to understand why Kew mattered so much to Banks, we need to understand how he thought about science itself. And, we've kind of gotten sense of that through these, numerous episodes we've done so far. So Banks, again, was not at heart a theorist, right? He had very little patience for science that stayed safely on the page, right? He believed knowledge should do something. And one early biographer actually put it rather perfectly. And he wrote, quote, every thought of Banks was practical. It tended everywhere and always to the application of the physical commodities of nature, to the improvement of the condition, and the multiplication of the physical resources of mankind. And look, this wasn't Banks being unusual, okay? This was Banks being very, very 18th century, because this is the age of improvement, of progress, right? A word that just keeps cropping up everywhere and means really rather more than it does today.
Improvement is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, historically, of course, look, improvement starts with land, right? Draining marshes, enclosing fields,
Correct.
Breeding better sheep, developing new crops, increasing yields, profits, and coincidentally, political influence.
Sounds a lot like everything we've talked about on almost every other episode.
Exactly. And Banks grows up steeped in that tradition of improvement, of progress, right? He's the 4th generation of agricultural improvers at his family estate of Revsby. And when he proposes draining a marsh there in 1767, and I think we talked about this in an earlier episode, his uncle writes back approvingly, almost poetically, saying that, quote, in this age of improvement, even fenlands might become the finest, richest country in Green Britain. So by the time Banks arrives at Kew, improvement isn't just a theory, it's a muscle memory. Now, as for Kew itself, right, that predates Banks. It begins as a royal garden, private, elegant, slightly experimental. Again, this is just a little bit of a refresh. We talked about this way back when at the beginning of the series. So George the Third's mother, Princess Augusta, had been deeply interested in botany. Her husband's friend, Lord Bute, a man remembered today largely for his politics, but Patrick, in his own time, was famed for his gardening and apparently his remarkably well-proportioned legs, whatever that means. Uh, but he was instrumental in shaping Kew's early botanical ambitions. And so by 1759, Kew already boasts a 9-acre physic or exotic garden devoted to medicinal plants. And it's placed under the care of William Ayton, a supremely capable Scottish gardener who will actually become one of the unsung heroes of this story later on.
So Banks isn't starting from nothing here.
No, no, not at all, not in the slightest. I mean, what Banks ends up really bringing is direction and, of course, scale, right? So if listeners remember, uh, Banks meets George III in the summer of 1771, and it's really one of those encounters that seems almost destined. So Farmer George, right, as the king is affectionately and sometimes mockingly known, he loves agriculture. He walks his farms and he even tilled the soil himself on occasion. Just imagine that, the king of England's tilling soil. He breeds livestock, he studies yields, and like Banks, he believes that knowledge should serve the nation. So somewhere between that first meeting and the autumn of 1772, Banks becomes the king's unofficial botanical advisor. No formal appointment, no ceremony, just purely based on trust. Fast forward to 1773, and Banks is now indispensable. He and the king are walking Kew together, often for hours, talking through projects, inspecting plans, making decisions on the spot. And and that's not an exaggeration. I mean, the king's equerry notes that these walks in his diary uh, with really almost comic regularity, that exotic gardens, sheep pens, new farm buildings are all being inspected under Banks's calm or authoritative eye. And this is important because Kew under Banks is not conceived as a research institution in the continental sense. Okay, it is not Paris's Jardin des Plantes. Banks doesn't need that, right? He already has his own herbarium, his own library, and a small army of botanists at home in Soho. Instead, Kew becomes something else entirely, a living catalog of global possibility. And Banks's goal is simple and, of course, audacious. Everything with Banks is audacious. He wants Kew to be supreme, right? Nationally, internationally. He wants new plants, especially economically useful ones, to appear first at the Royal Botanic Gardens, to pass through British hands, to be tested, propagated, and then sent on.
So Q becomes the clearinghouse for botanical power. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, that's
Okay.
the perfect way to put it. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
place where empire takes root, sometimes literally. So Banks believes deeply that colonies should be made useful. They shouldn't just exist purely for existence. They need to do something. He believes that soils should yield commodities, that plants, things like breadfruit, spices, fibers, fruits, that they can be transferred, improved, and redeployed for profit. And this belief places him squarely in the lineage of Francis Bacon, right? Science as mastery over nature, justified by progress. And yet, Banks is not a simple caricature. He holds abolitionist views. He is disgusted by slavery when he sees it in practice. He argues later, quite explicitly, that slavery must end, if not for moral reasons, then for commercial ones. And it's really a revealing position and a deeply 18th century one. Yet still, his system benefits from empire, right? There's no getting around that. Uh, Now, back at Kew, Banks works closely with William Ayton, again, who runs this garden with extraordinary efficiency. Plants are labeled, cataloged, organized. Essentially, order is replacing chaos, and slowly, deliberately, Kew becomes the most important living plant collection in the world. But here's the thing, Patrick. Banks himself is not doing the collecting anymore.
Uh-oh. Now we've got a problem. Okay. Now, this is where the web starts to spread.
That's right. Banks's network is growing because Banks's real genius lies not in just what he knows, but in who
Correct.
he knows, right? I mean, the same thing as today. It's not what you know, it's who you
No,
know.
yeah, exactly.
Uh, be-
Exactly.
because to turn Q into a botanical really a global botanical exchange. Banks needs ships. He needs surgeons, governors, missionaries, merchants, gardeners, all scattered
Yep.
across this planet. Each one a potential agent in his grand experiment.
Very true. Because before Banks, under Lord Bute, there were plants coming in, and of course, but it was all sort of opportunistic, right? So
Yeah.
someone turns up with a curiosity, someone else drops off a cutting, and if it survives, great, right?
Yeah.
If not, well, guess what, John? That's nature.
That's
Now,
what he
Banks
did.
looks at I would say, kind of at that and thinks, this simply won't do for me, right? What he wants to breadth is scale, coverage. He wants Q to be living a map of the world's useful plants, food, medicine, timber, fibers, anything that might feed people, heal them, clothe them, or enrich the empire. And to do that, he doesn't just need greenhouses, he needs people, lots of them everywhere. Okay. And the crucial thing is this: Banks almost never goes anywhere himself again. Right? Can you believe that? I mean, we talked about this in the previous episodes. Instead of his, you know, see, right? He sits at the center of a vast humming web of correspondence, like you were just listing: surgeons, governors, missionaries, naval officers, merchants, artists, amateur botanists, and the occasional aristocrat. Okay. With the taste for seeds in their pockets. So letters flow into London. Okay. Parcels follow, seeds, bulbs, cuttings, dried specimens, and Banks orchestrates it all with extraordinary tact. And there's a simple rule that underpins the whole operation: dried specimens, pressed plants, herbarium sheets. These go into Banks's private collection.
Of course they do.
Right? Yeah, I did. Listen,
These are
Banks has
mine.
something up his sleeve, and live plants and seeds, they go to Q. It's neat. It's really efficient, and it ensures that Banks remains both the scientific authority and the institutional gatekeeper.
Yeah, which really, based on everything we've heard about Banks to this point, it's very in character of him.
Sounds about
That's
right.
classic Banks.
Oh, 100%. And he's doing all of this with a combination of charm, persistence, and the occasional quiet nudge behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Take North America in 1773. So we're talking very early in Banks's reign at Kew. Nearly 800 taxa of trees and shrubs arrive, many of which, okay, end up planted in the gardens: oaks, maples, pines, things that will eventually reshape British landscapes. A huge part of that comes through Dr. John Fothergill, who ropes in our dear old friend, John Bartram
Oh,
in
he's back.
America. Bartram's back, everyone. We have been to
We
Bartram's
have.
garden.
We have.
Okay.
Yeah.
Talk about history. It's not just Banks now writing letters, it's Banks persuading other people to mobilize their networks on his behalf.
Which, you know what? Also sounds very modern, actually, because I mean, he's basically running the LinkedIn for plants, right? That's what he's doing.
I'm just glad Bartram's
Leveraging
back,
his,
man.
yeah.
I need
He
to,
was friended.
I need to get back to Philadelphia.
Yeah.
I need to get back to Bartram's garden. That was a very nice trip. Are you sure you don't want to come with me in March? Tell me.
I don't think there's gonna be much growing in the gardens in
Oh,
March,
I
I'm
know, I
afraid.
know. All right, listen. This guy is just truly extraordinary, right? So here's another example. James Bruce, the Scottish explorer searching for the source of the Nile, he sends seeds from oh, that's a good one, John. Help me out with this one. Abyssinia? Is that about right? Or
I'll say that sounds right.
okay, perfect.
Abyssinia.
That's a hard
Abyssinia.
one. When if listeners, please correct us. We want to hear that. When Bruce returns with 40 volumes of illustrations, though, John, okay, Banks quietly arranges these custom exemptions. No small favor, right? At the request of the artist Zophany, again, another character we met earlier in the series. They celebrated a painter who may have been painted Banks while at Eton. Remember that?
I
So
do, yeah.
and in this, Banks is all over. Practical help in exchange for botanical loyalty. In Jamaica, Hinton East, planter, administrator, serious collector, ships back major consignments. From India, Sir John Murray sends packets of seeds while on military service. None of these men officially working for Kew. They're part of something, I would say, looser, more human, and in many ways more effective. And then there are the cases where Banks puts his own money on the line. So William Brass is a good example and a rather tragic one. Brass is a gardener, not a gentleman, sent out in 1780 to the Gold Coast, modern Ghana, on a pretty much a shoestring salary of 130 pounds a year. He's collecting for a little syndicate, the Duke of Northumberland. That's right, Northumberland. Banks himself, Fothergill, and the nurseryman James Lee. Okay, all those characters are back. They're together. Brass gets a minor secretarial post with the East India Company, which we've talked about on the
Yeah.
show.
Yeah.
But in reality, he's left to fend for himself in extreme, brutal conditions. Still, he sends things home. 42 taxa of seed, herbarium specimens, right? Botanical drawings. Guess what, though? He dies on the voyage back in 1783. And even his drawings, loaned to the Swedish botanist Adam Afzelius, are eventually all lost. It's a reminder that this global network is built not just on curiosity and ambition, but on real personal cost too, John.
Yeah. And Afzelius, this guy you just mentioned, is really where things start to overlap, isn't it? I mean, you have science, empire, philanthropy, just everything getting tangled together.
Hey, you're right. Completely correct. I mean, Afzelius is about almost a case study in how Banks operates, John.
Yeah.
So this guy, he arrives in London in 1791 as soon, right, as it, swept into Banks's orbit. Around the same time, William Wilberforce, that's an abolitionist, reformer, and driving force behind the Sierra Leone Company, comes to Banks with a problem. They're establishing a colony for Black loyalists in West Africa, and they need a botanist who understands tropical plants. Banks recommends Afzelius, and everyone's happy. He goes out to Sierra Leone, and this is classic Banks, okay? He also agrees to collect for Kew.
Of course.
Banks supplies equipment, advice, and backing to Afzelius, right? And within weeks of arriving at Freetown in 1792, Afzelius is sending seeds and bulbs back to London. He returns briefly to England, complaining cheerfully that this climate is very damp and insectivorous, okay? And the heads back again. Seems like he's got he's liking what he's doing, but
He's raking up the miles.
yeah. This time though, with Kew, trained gardener and a specially designed plant cabin. Okay, so these plant cabins, little greenhouses bolted onto ships, are another Banks innovation. I mean, you remember, sea voyages could last 9 months.
Yeah.
Salt spray, temperature swings, mold, rot, plants died constantly. Banks designs protective structures, even fits like prototypes to ships like HMS Guardian. It's experimental, but fragile, right? And absolutely essential. But guess what, John? Then there's disaster.
Disaster. Yeah.
Yep. In 1794, Freetown is attacked by a French naval force. Afzelius watches his garden destroyed, his animals slaughtered, his journalists and collections, everything worth 1,600 pounds obliterated. It's a total catastrophe. And yet Banks writes back cheerfully, draw on me for funds, replace everything, keep going. And guess what? Afzelius does. Keeps collecting, keeps sending specimens home. Even when Wilberforce complains that his employees are moonlighting for Kew, Banks replies with exquisite politeness, perhaps the company should take Afzelius' advice and plant the very species Kew is happy to supply. It's diplomatic jujitsu.
Yeah, it is.
I see what you did there.
It is. That's Banks in and out. I mean, and it's really managerial genius. I mean, everyone thinks they're getting the better deal here.
Of course. And actually, John, often, they are.
Yeah.
That's the brilliance of this. And nowhere is this more evident than in Banks' relationship with the East India Company. Okay. This is the most productive partnership he ever cultivates. Banks gives advice freely, what to plant, where, what might be useful. In return, the company's far flung gardens become pipelines feeding Kew. St. Helena sends plants. Governor's Banks once dined with now ship seeds across oceans. But India is the real prize, John.
Yeah.
Banks corresponds for decades with William Roxburgh, the Scottish surgeon botanist, often called the father of Indian botany. Roxburgh moves from Nagaur to Samalkot, then Madras, then Calcutta. I mean, founding experimental gardens wherever he goes. Okay. I kind of like this guy. Okay. These aren't pleasure gardens, they're testing grounds for crops, teak for ships, indigo for dye, cacao, coffee, sago palms, date palms, mulberries, right? With their silkworms, of course.
Yeah.
The Calcutta Botanic Garden, founded in 1786 with Banks's backing, is explicitly about utility. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Kidd says it outright. This is not about curiosities, but about commerce, food, medicine, and wealth. Banks writes advisory lists of plants to import from across Asia. Roxborough sends drawing seeds and live plants, some arriving at Kew under the care of its own gardeners. And the line continues, John. I know. You're like, whoa, this is a long line. Buchanan Hamilton follows Roxborough. Then Nathaniel Wallach, appointed largely on Banks's recommendation, of course, sends consignments from India and Nepal for decades. Even after Banks's death, this is an institutional momentum. Okay. And then, of course, there's China, the great locked garden.
Yeah.
Banks is obsessed, tea above all. Okay. When the McCartney embassy sails into 1792, Banks floods it with instructions, a 3,500 word gardening manual, and a wish list of plants. Typical Banks.
So Banks.
2 Kew gardeners go along. The mission fails diplomatically, everyone, but not entirely botanically. A rose, a plump poppy, okay, camellias grown later at Banks's own spring grove. So by the time Banks reaches the height of his power, Kew is no longer just receiving plants. It's directing flows of knowledge, labor, living material across the globe, and crucially, Banks himself rarely even leaves London.
Yeah. He has a good. So I mean, up to this point, as you've been painting, Patrick, I mean, Kew had grown largely through favors, really. I mean, seeds sent by colonial governors, curiosities swapped with correspondence, the odd botanical treasure arriving almost by accident at his doorstep. But now, uh, Banks keeps all that going, of course, but he never stops cultivating friendships, right? I mean,
No.
that's always going to be part of his life. But alongside it, he's building something new, methodical, ordered acquisition policy run from Kew itself. And this is why, with some justification, he's often called the father of scientific plant hunting.
Which I guess sounds thrilling, but also faintly sinister, everyone.
Yeah, thrilling and imperial.
Yeah.
We like a good plant hunter here on the History of Fresh Birds. Remember David Fairchild's,
I love David
Roger
Fairchild.
Fortune. We've had a few plant hunters,
Yeah,
but
100%.
but yeah, I mean, with the king's full backing, Banks begins dispatching Q trained gardeners around the world with a very clear brief: don't just bring back pretty things. Collect everything that's new to science. So that means trees, shrubs, grasses, mosses, food plants, the whole botanical universe. Nothing's off the list. And crucially, he embeds these men into voyages of discovery, right? These are not Q missions. They're kind of hijackers on other missions. So we're talking naval expeditions, surveying missions, colonial journeys. Sometimes they're gardeners, sometimes surgeon nationalists, sometimes both, but always with instructions from Banks, always reporting back to Soho Square. And the first great test case is Francis Masson. So Masson, and I believe again we talked very briefly about him earlier. He's a Scottish undergardener at Kew, not a gentleman scientist, not a grand theorist. He's just a simple working gardener. And in 1772, he sails with Cook's Resolution as far as Cape Town and then stays behind. And for the next 3 years, he just vanishes into the landscape. And the Cape Colony turns out to be this botanical gold mine. And Masson tramps through mountains, deserts, coastal scrub. I mean, all these different elements. And he teams up actually with Carl Thunberg, one of Linnaeus's pupils, nonetheless. Linnaeus has his hands everywhere as well. And together they roam the Cape Peninsula like two kids in a sweet shop. I mean, this is amazing. And by the time Masson reports back, he's collected over 500 species new to science. 500. I mean, that's not a good return, Patrick. That's an astonishing one.
Oh, listen, and this is when the phrase Royal Botanic Gardens
Yeah,
starts being used, right, John?
it is. This is at least this first that we know of, according to record. So Masson's account, published by the Royal Society, is the first time that name, Royal Botanic Gardens, appears in print. And it's a quiet moment. It's not a huge thing. But Kew again is no longer just a pleasant royal garden. It's becoming an institution. I mean, that's what that name suggests. And Banks, of course, now has proof of concept, right? The king is delighted at this. And with that delight, the purse strings start to loosen. And so Masson is sent out again and again after that. So we're talking Madeira, the Canaries, the Azores, the Caribbean. He's captured by the French at Grenada. He survives a hurricane at St. Lucia, loses entire collections to storms and war and, sometimes the bad luck, but he keeps on going. And eventually, after really decades of this life of trudging, collecting, drying, packing, shipping, Masson dies in Montreal, just worn out and disappointed by his final North American expedition. But there's a little bit of a silver lining because Linnaeus names a genus after him, Masonia. So it's a quiet botanical immortality for Mr. Mason, or Masson, I should say.
Yeah, and Banks learns from Masson, doesn't he? He becomes very picky about who he sends.
Oh, extremely. I mean, look, Banks has a type, right? We all have a type. Banks has one too. And so, what's Banks's type? So, almost all Scots. It has to be Scottish educated, Q trained. Uh, these men are industrious, frugal, obedient, mild tempered, no freelancing, no stealing, or sorry, no selling plants to nurseries on the side, which we've heard before. I mean, that for Banks is a mortal sin. So that's kind of the profile of who he's looking for. And then once you're hired, Banks doesn't let you go. He briefs you in Soho Square. He writes to you constantly. So think of that boss that's just emailing you nonstop of things to do and questions and demands. He monitors you from the other side of the world. Again, this is all before internet and the technology we have today. And he will also reprimand you if you go off script. So Masson himself is told off actually twice for making unsanctioned journeys into the interior of Africa. Um, and as far as the pay, not great, Patrick. If you're looking to be a plant hunter under the watch of
I
things,
might be, maybe
100.
not under Banks, but maybe.
Yeah, so you get £100 a year if you're lucky, sometimes much less. And look, this is not a path to riches. Okay. If you're doing this, it's a calling. You are pretty much just as enthusiastic about plants as Banks is. But Banks knows how to extract value. So let's look at China. So we just talked about, or you talked about it very briefly, but um, at the time when he wanted to go, it was being blocked from South America by war. So Banks seizes on an opportunity when an East India Company man named David Lance asks what he should collect in Canton. And so Banks replies, "Don't collect, just take a plant hunter with you. I don't want you to do it. I want one of my guys to do it." And this is where we meet William Kerr. So again, another Scot, son of a nurseryman, known to Banks as, quote, well behaved and considerate. And Kerr is dispatched to Canton in 1803 with royal approval, East India Company support, and a salary so low, Patrick, it can barely cover laundry. So again, not a high-paying job. This whole thing. Now, Kerr's instructions are detailed and ambitious. He has to learn Chinese cultivation techniques. He has to send live plants back to Kew and pay special attention to fiber plants and economically useful species. So not, doesn't sound like an easy job to me. Um, Now, China, however, is not especially keen to cooperate to make matters worse. So foreigners are restricted. Gardeners pot plants in heavy clay that kills them at sea. Pirates are roaming the coast of China. But in the midst of all this, Kerr survives largely thanks to the kindness of East India Company officials. And through it all, he actually astonishingly succeeds. So he sends back the Caria japonica, the Banks's rose, the China fir, the tiger lily, camellias, honeysuckle. I mean, seeds are collected personally near Macau. And when pirates make that visit impossible, he slips off to Manila without permission, which is, a no-no. And Banks scolds him, of course, for this because, again, he had very strict instructions of where to be and what kind of plants to focus on. But Banks being Banks, he can't quite hide his admiration for that. And so eventually, Kerr is rewarded with a post in Ceylon, helping to establish the botanic garden at Paradenia. And he finally has authority and he has space and purpose. But Patrick, then he dies of tropical illness barely 2 years later.
Yeah, and there's something grimly consistent about that,
Yeah,
right?
very, very. It happens with many of his plant hunters, unfortunately, dying of these sorts of things. Um, so, speaking of another example of a plant hunter, so we have Archibald Menzies, perhaps the most dramatic of them all. So, in 1794, Menzies stands on the frozen summit of Mauna Loa, thermometer below freezing, having just completed the first recorded ascent. And he's there because Banks has inserted him into George Vancouver's surveying voyage. Now, Vancouver completely hates this. He hates Banks's interference. He hates the glass plant cabin that's on his deck. He hates Menzies' independence. But Banks is unfazed by this. He sends Menzies a 13-point instruction manual and quietly warns him that if Vancouver obstructs his work, write it down, keep keep documentation. And Menzies does do this. And so, despite goats and dogs, cats, rainstorms, and this furious Captain Vancouver, Menzies sends back whenever he can, specimens. And at a dinner in Chile, as an example, when he served a dessert containing seeds of the chili pine, he pockets them instead of eating them. And actually, Patrick, one survives at Kew for nearly a century. And this is the monkey puzzle tree, soon to be everywhere in Britain. Now, eventually, the conflict between Menzies and Vancouver does explode thanks to an argument over damaged plants. And as a result of that, Vancouver arrests Menzies, confines him to his cabin, demands his journals. Menzies refuses outright to surrender those. And of course, Banks is not going to let that just all happen. So he intervenes from London. And by the time the ship reaches the Thames, the matter has been quietly smoothed over because that's how Banks operates.
Banks as fixer in chief reporting for duty.
Yeah, Banks knows his way around a conflict. And
100%.
he never really stops. I mean, after Napoleon falls, he finally sends collectors to Brazil, which is where he had wanted to go initially before China. And of course, it's two more Scott plant hunters, and from that visit, they get bromeliads, orchids, forests mapped and stripped of specimens. And so by now, nearly 7,000 new exotic plants, that number we talked about at the very top of this episode, have reached Britain in this reign alone. Not all economically useful, of course. Okay. Many wildly actually impractical, but collectively transformative. And that's really the key point. These men weren't just treasure hunters for empire. Banks insisted they collect botanically. Basically, knowledge first, utility, if it followed, was a bonus. So, I mean, these hunters were, they were hardy, obsessive, underpaid, and astonishingly effective. And they turned Q into something entirely new because once all these plants started arriving, so seeds, cuttings, living specimens from every corner of the globe, Q itself had to change, right? And so when we come back after the break, Patrick, That's where we're going to go. We're going to see how Banks transformed Kew from a royal garden into the beating scientific heart of a global botanical empire. We'll be right back. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the history of fresh produce. So we've heard kind of about Banks's approach with collecting specimens, Patrick, and how he built his network and was able to get his hands on all these thousands of plants from around the world. But the question we asked was, how is he going to manage all these specimens? After all, Kew was originally just a royal garden meant for a few to wander and admire interesting plants, right? The royal family. Um,
Yep.
but if it was now going to house thousands of plants from different climates, things would have to change. And this is where Banks really earns his reputation, not just as a collector, but as a builder, right? Because under Banks, Kew stops being a pleasant royal garden and turns into something closer really a living laboratory of empire. And I mentioned plants from different climates, okay? And this is important because remember, you're hauling plants from the Cape, from New South Wales, from China, from South America, and they're arriving half dead, battered by months even with all these innovations at the time. These plants are just utterly confused about the English climate, right?
Right?
These things don't want to grow in Richmond.
Yeah, it's not exactly the natural habitat for an Australian eucalyptus or a South African erica, like, right?
No, you're not.
Not the right environment.
That's not where these plants want to be in cold, wet Britain. And Banks realizes this obviously very quickly that if he wants these botanical trophies to survive, sentimentality is not going to do it alone. He needs
Right?
infrastructure. So what happens at Kew slowly but relentlessly is a building program. So you got glass houses, hot houses, heated structures, spaces designed not for strolling aristocrats, but for nursing fragile specimens back from the brink.
Right.
And one of the most striking examples actually comes in 1788 when Banks commissions a huge lean-to glass house specifically for Francis Masson's South African collections.
Mm.
And this thing, Patrick, it is enormous by the standards of the day. So we're talking 110 feet long, 17 feet wide, 14 feet high, heated by flues running beneath the floor. I mean, it's definitely not a pretty thing, but it's functional and it's designed to keep plants alive.
Yeah, this is like horticulture getting like serious, everyone. Seriously.
Yeah, it's getting kicked up a notch.
Right?
This is now
Yeah.
a business, right? And it doesn't stop there, Patrick.
Commercialization.
Yeah,
It's
and it
all happening.
and it definitely doesn't stop there because as more plants pour in, so from Australia in particular, because remember they have that colony going on now, new hothouses are going up to house them, and so by around 1800, Kew even has what are described as infirmary or hospital
Okay.
hothouses, and I just love this phrase because it tells you everything about how Banks thought about plants, and these are exactly what you'd expect. These are places, hothouses, where newly arrived sickly specimens could be nursed back to health. So you can almost imagine them on botanical, life support. They're getting extra warmth, careful watering, constant attention until they're basically strong enough to be moved out into the wider collection.
You're so right. And how crazy is that? It's kind of a triage system of plants, I would say.
Yeah, it is. It really is. And this is the crucial point, right? He's not just accumulating plants, he's building the systems needed to sustain a global collection. And so by the turn of the 19th century, Kew is really unlike anything else in Britain and probably anywhere else in Europe. And in 1801, William Ayton, again, the guy running the whole garden, at least the day-to-day operations, he states it bluntly. He says, quote, "This establishment is placed under the direction of Sir Joseph Banks." And there's really no ambiguity about it. I mean, Kew is Banks's project, and the numbers are staggering because when Banks sailed on the Endeavour, if listeners recall, in 1768, Kew cultivated roughly 600 taxa, right? And that's already pretty respectable.
Yeah, that's respectable.
But when the second vastly expanded edition of Hortus Cuensis appears between 1810 and 1813, 5 volumes prepared by Ayton It describes over 11,000 taxa growing at Kew.
Wow. I mean, that's not incremental growth. I mean, could you tell by the silence, everyone? Like, wow, that's an explosion.
Yeah,
John,
600
wow.
to 11,000, that's a lot.
It's funny because as we research this and we see some of the things we find out, like 11,000 taxa
Yeah,
from the 600 that was already respectable. So,
yeah. I mean, what's fascinating is where these plants are coming from too, right?
right.
So Australia dominates, of course, so you got around 300 species there. South America contributes roughly 260. Siberia, might not think of it, but they're contributing 220 plants. China around 120. So this is a global snapshot of a botanical imperialism. And then there's South Africa, which really deserves special attention because again, Francis Masson alone introduces nearly 1,000 taxa from the Cape, nearly 1,000. And his haul includes 183 species of erica, 175 of Mesembryanthemum. I hope I'm saying that. I'm probably not saying that right. These Latin words are killers. Over 100 Pelargonium, dozens of oxalis and Stapelia. I mean, just all these names alone and the numbers of it. It's extraordinary.
Yeah. And these aren't just like obscure scientific specimens, right? These are plants that are going to end up in British gardens, John,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Kew becomes a place of pilgrimage, really. I mean,
right?
gardeners, nurserymen, aristocrats, they're all coming to see the latest introductions. I mean, what Banks is doing at Kew directly fuels Britain's obsession with novelty and gardening. The strange, the exotic, the never before seen. That's what people want. And Kew is where it appears first. Now, Banks Patrick, he's generally generous about sharing this bounty of botanical wonders, but, and this is important, there are rules because Banks is always good for rules. Now, the rule is Q gets the plant first, and only once a species has been propagated enough that it's no longer rare, it will be released more widely.
Wow. See? See? So he's a genius, right? And very generous, but on his own terms, right?
Yeah, very much so. So Banks is
Thanks,
fiercely,
man. I'm
yeah.
telling you. Nothing
No,
surprises me with this guy anymore.
no, well, he wants things a certain way, and he's doing it because he's very protective of the king's collection. He's not going to be bullied into giving things away prematurely. I mean, remember, these plants, they didn't just come by easily. These represent years of effort, risk, and expense. They're not party favors, Patrick, that you're just going to hand out willy-nilly. But, and this is where it gets interesting, because the king himself is actually quite willing to use Q's treasures for political purposes. And so through that, plants actually become instruments of diplomacy. So in 1793, a request arrives from Catherine II of Russia, Catherine the Great herself, that is, and she wants plants from Kew to adorn the new hothouses and gardens at Sarkoye Selo and Pavlovsk palaces just south of St. Petersburg. And these gardens are being laid out in the fashionable English landscape style. And Kew is obviously the place to turn.
This sounds like a polite exchange between enlightened monarchs, John.
Yeah, it does. But you know what? It's actually much more than that because this is really geopolitics in a pot. Remember, Britain is at war with revolutionary France at this time. Russia's position in this conflict really matters enormously, particularly in the Baltic, where Denmark and Sweden could really tip the balance of this conflict. And so sending plants is a way of cementing alliances, of signaling friendship, of greasing the wheels of trade. Now, war, of course, is going to delay things, but in the spring of 1795, probably the 4th of April, George III and Banks are chatting, as they often do, and the king gives the order: select, pack, and ship the finest collection of exotics that can be spared from Kew. And so it's not just the plants that ends up being gifted. The gift also includes architectural drawings of the greenhouses needed to house these plants through Russian winters, because this is even harsher than English winters. They even prepared to send a Kew gardener, George No. Uh, they're not just giving him like he's not like something to give away. He's actually going on loan, and he's going to be there to instruct the Russian counterpart of how to handle all this.
So they're exporting not just plants, but expertise.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
I
it's
get it.
think about it like an
Part of the
all-inclusive.
journey.
Yeah, yeah, it's like a kit. It's like a do-it-yourself kit, you know? They're giving you the plants, the structure, and the person. Um, so in early July, a consignment of 300 potted plants, 226 species from 130 genera, set off from London aboard a Russian company ship called Venus, escorted by HMS Daedalus. I think that's how you say it. And Banks even designs, of course he does, a special two-tier structure for the ship's hold to accommodate the plants safely. And eventually the ship gets there, and Catherine the Great is just delighted. And she's so delighted that she rewards Noah with 100 ducats and a gold watch. Banks, on the other hand, Patrick, who has advanced, mind you, 162 pounds of his own money to cover the costs, waits 3 years to be reimbursed by the British Treasury, and of course receives no thanks whatsoever.
Which feels very on brand for the British state or any state, I guess.
Yeah, the government's very rarely to hand out thanks and pay you in a timely fashion. But Banks being Banks, he keeps going because he's also remarkably careful with the king's person. Although, Q is technically the king's collection, George III directly pays only really a small part of the overall cost, usually just the plant hunter's salary and sometimes not even that. So where's the funds coming from? Because it's not just banks either. So much of it actually comes from the Home Office, the Board of Trade, the East India Company, the Admiralty. The East India Company actually carries plant hunters and bankrolls embassies. I mean, that's how significant that institution is. Naval voyages provide transport and salaries. And so Banks is constantly persuading departments to absorb costs that benefit Q. And in some cases, Robert Brown and Archibald Menzies, for instance, Banks even convinces the Admiralty to continue paying naturalist salaries after they return home while they sort, describe, and publish their collections.
So botany becomes a semi official arm of the state.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, under Banks, botany, empire, commerce, government, finance become entangled. They're just all fusing together. I mean, Kew is no longer just a garden, right? It's a hub. It's a hub of science, of diplomacy, of economic ambition, and all of this is happening under the calm, genial exterior of Joseph Banks, chatting with the king, hosting visitors, writing endless letters. Which actually, Patrick, brings us to a rather unexpected turn because among all these respectable pursuits, glasshouses, diplomacy, imperial science, Banks is also quietly involved in something far more controversial, at least in today's world. Isn't that right?
Yes, indeed. Because Joseph Banks wasn't just orchestrating the globe, right? It wasn't the global movement of crops, right? He also quite accidentally became Britain's first known cannabis supplier.
Of course he did.
Of course, we love it. But to understand how Banks ends up in this role, we need to rewind a bit because, as ever with Banks, this starts not with recreational curiosity, but with ships, empire, and very serious naval logistics, right?
Yeah,
For most of human history, cannabis wasn't controversial at all. Hemp cannabis, sativa, originated thousands of years ago as a food and fiber crop in China and India. By the Middle Ages, it had become indispensable. Okay. Rope, sails, uniforms, paper. Without hemp, there is no age of exploration. In fact, the very word canvas comes from cannabis. That's how foundational this plant was, John.
yeah, which is really wild when you think about how it's talked about today, right? Now, that's not it's not what we think today.
Yeah, people don't really think about canvases or sails when they hear cannabis. But, John, in the 16th or 19th centuries, a single British man of war needed 60 to 80 tons of hemp. That's half a square mile of crops just to rig one ship.
Wow.
Hemp, in strategic terms, was oil. No hemp, no navy, no navy, no empire. And that is where Joseph Banks enters, sleeves rolled up. Okay. Banks becomes obsessed, truly obsessed with securing a stable hemp supply for Britain. He promotes hemp cultivation across the empire, particularly in India, where it's grown to produce rope and canvas for shipping. He later joins the Board of Trade in 1797 and effectively assumes control of Britain's hemp supply. He gives hemp seeds to the First Fleet in 1788. And actually, we didn't really mention this in our last episode, but Australia, in Banks' mind, is not just a penal colony. It's meant to be a hemp producing powerhouse feeding the Royal Navy for generations, John.
Yeah, that's true. We did not mention that, but I mean, so among everything else, then I mean, Banks is basically the godfather of imperial hemp. That's just added to the list of titles for Mr. Banks.
100%. He really is a self confessed hemp zealot. And it's through this imperial hemp network that something else catches his attention. In Bombay, Banks is told by Dr. Helena Scott that cannabis indica, a different strain, is a widely used as a narcotic, often instead of opium. This isn't hemp as rope. This is cannabis as medicine, or at least cannabis as something interesting.
Yeah,
Soon after, Joseph Matra, remember him? The
yeah.
British loyalist in America who wanted to make Australia a loyalist colony. Okay. He begins sending Banks flasks of cannabis indica from Tangier, not seeds, not fiber, hashish, along with instructions on how to use it and a summary, really, of its effects.
So Banks has a stash then.
Oh, he does. John, come on.
He's got a stash.
Locked away somewhere respectable, no doubt, among the plant specimens.
Uh,
Um, and word spreads, and eventually the word reaches Samuel Taylor Coleridge, poet, philosopher, and enthusiastic opium addict.
of course.
He hears that Banks has cannabis, and he immediately thinks of his friend Thomas Wedgwood, the son of a famous potter.
Yeah, well, actually, Witch Patrick is another familiar face here in the history of fresh produce. We met Wedgwood in our pineapple episodes. The man with the fancy china, with the pineapple design china.
Yep,
Right?
100%. You're exactly right. And who's who of the history of fresh produce here, right?
A lot
So
of
this
visitors. Yeah.
particular Wedgwood is a pioneer in the early photography, experimenting with silver nitrate, and those experiments leave him seriously ill. Chronic pain, severe intestinal problems, and generally miserable conditions. Coleridge becomes convinced that cannabis might help. And so he writes to a mutual, say, acquaintance, that landscape painter Samuel Purkis, with a very specific request, right? He says, beautifully, of course, that there exists a preparation of the Indian hemp called bang, taken by Malays who become most, I would say, potvolent drawkinsters, is that how you say it? And occasionally run amok. And he asked Perkins if he happens to see Sir Joseph Banks, whether he might procure just a small quantity.
Just a little bit.
Coleridge then adds casually that you may mention that Banks is an intimate.
Yeah, as one does, you know. Oh yes, Sir Joseph, my personal friend, you know, the guy with the cannabis. Just want a little, just a tiny
Exactly.
bit.
And that's how it happens, right, John? Through a poet, a painter, a sick inventor, and a botanist with global reach, Joseph Banks becomes, so far as we know, the first supplier of cannabis in Britain, right?
Pretty wild.
Not as a drug dealer, though, as a man of science. I look at myself as a man of science now that we talk about this, and a curator of global plants, a fixer at the center of empire, quietly passing along a substance he understands as medicinal, botanical, and worthy of study. It's a moment that captures Banks perfectly. He doesn't moralize, he doesn't panic, he observes, collects, and distributes.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty ironic, isn't it? I mean, hemp was once maybe the most important plant on earth, and then later it gets swept up in this stigma of fear and just outright panic today, right? I mean, if you mention cannabis to somebody, they're gonna think like narcotics and drugs.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, well, it depends on which state you live in, right?
I guess so. I
Some
mean,
are
that's starting to change
recreational,
a little bit, I
but
guess.
even in some countries, it's, I mean, like, it's fully like, whoa, that's
Yeah.
like gets your hand cut off, or you're in jail for the rest of your life. I'm just, making those up, but you know what I mean? It's like there's some
Yeah, yeah.
crazy laws for cannabis, because hemp really did underpin trade, war, and colonial expansion for centuries. But by early 1800s, things started to change. Global demand is beginning to fade. Coal replaces hemp as the strategic resource of choice, John. So steam replaces sail, and the world that made hemp essential starts to disappear. Banks grand vision for Australia as a hemp superpower never quietly materializes. Not because it was foolish, but because history moved faster than he expected. Still, whether we're talking about the breadfruit tree, eucalyptus, or even cannabis, what you see again and again is this: banks understood plants as power, infrastructure, as the quiet engines of an empire. And in that sense, John, his unexpected role as Britain's first cannabis supplier isn't an odd footnote. It's a perfect example of how deeply his influence ran.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. Makes a lot of sense. Now let's put cannabis to the side. Go, I think we've had our dose of cannabis. Now, uh, let's come back to Q, because as we begin to wrap up this episode, there's one thing that's very obvious to me here, at least, Patrick, that Banks's legacy at Q isn't simply that he filled it with plants, right? I mean, it's that he professionalized plant hunting itself. He turned what had once been a mixture of gentlemanly curiosity, imperial chance, and sheer luck into something, really organized and methodical and crucially repeatable, right? And that's why his influence still lingers today.
Definitely, because when we talk about Q now, we're not just talking about some beautiful gardens, right? We're
Yeah.
talking about a scientific institution with global reach.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even today, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, I mean, still sends out plant collectors. What we'd once may have called plant hunters, which we were talking about, they're being sent around the world. In fact, actually, Patrick, I just noticed this a couple of weeks ago on LinkedIn. I follow Q's page there, and they made a post that at least 100, I think it was more than that, new plants were added to their catalog last year. So this is still going on.
Wow.
Now, the difference, of course, is that now this work is regulated by international treaties, ethical frameworks, and
Mm.
conservation priorities, right? You don't have these crazy guys going out into countries and just, I'm here to find plants and stuff. The emphasis has shifted from imperial extraction to, biodiversity protection and scientific understanding. But the bones of that system, the idea that Q should coordinate global plant collecting and research and distribution, that goes straight back to Banks. So every seed bank, every herbarium sheet, every carefully logged specimen is part of a tradition that he helped invent.
And it's funny, isn't it? Because most people feel Banks' influence without having the faintest idea of who he was,
Absolutely. I mean, and we're
right?
we're we're guilty to that to an extent too. Before we did the research here,
Oh,
um,
100%.
but yeah, I mean, really, Banks's influence is felt every time you walk through a British garden center or a suburban garden in the home counties or a stately home landscape, or really, indeed, any park in America, Australia, or Europe. The vast majority of ornamental plants we take for granted, so the rhododendrons, the camellias, the magnolias, the azaleas, the wisterias, which I have in my yard, they're not native, right? They're there because of a vast century-long wave of plant hunting that peaked in the 19th century and early 20th century. And that wave didn't come out of nowhere. It flowed directly from the policy banks devised, identifying promising regions, sending trained collectors, centralizing knowledge and living specimens at Kew, and then again, redistribute. And so tens of thousands of species arrived on British shores through this process. And while many of those later plant hunters never met Banks, like David Fairchild, for example, who was not even British, he was American, they were all working in a world that he had shaped.
But it's worth saying Q itself didn't just sail smoothly into the future once Banks was gone, John. Come on.
No, actually, it was quite the opposite. So when Banks died in 1820, coincidentally the same year as George III, Q lost its two greatest champions almost simultaneously. And without that personal patronage, it just, kind of did what you would expect. It fell into decline. So for a while, Q was directionless, underfunded, somewhat neglected. It still existed, but it lacked purpose. And so it wasn't until 1837 that the government finally stepped in and established a commission to review really all the royal palaces and gardens. And when that commission reported back in 1841, the verdict on Kew was quite clear. It needed to be transformed. And the recommendation was that Kew be reborn as a scientific institution. So it became nationalized, centrally funded, open to the public, and placed under professional leadership. But who was going to lead it? Well, that came in the form of Sir William Hooker, appointed as the first official director of Kew. And In many ways, Hooker was completing Banks's unfinished business.
Of course. So Banks sort of loses control at the end.
Yeah,
Okay. But he wins the argument in the long run.
exactly right. Because
Hey,
over the course of his lifetime, Banks, he really did achieve his core aim, and that was, for Kew to become the most diverse living collection of plants anywhere in Europe and probably the
yep,
world's, right?
you're right.
He never saw it as just a botanical library. For Banks, Kew had a job to do, right? Everything had a purpose, everything had a job. And as we've been seeing throughout this series, he was unapologetically a colonialist. He believed in exploration, colonization, and commerce, that all these things went in hand. And he was acutely aware of the economic value of plants, whether that was food, medicine, timber for ships, fibers, dyes, whatever it was. Plants to Banks were strategic assets. And he worried about Britain's dependence on foreign powers for vital commodities. He understood the geopolitical risks of relying on rivals for crops like spices, timber, tea. I mean, the echoes of today is just it's very similar, right? We were hearing that in today's world, this fear of reliance on foreign powers. And so he believed that Q could help solve that problem.
And which, let's be real, which is where the empire-wide network comes in,
Yeah.
everyone.
Because again, Q could never function alone to act as that
Right?
global as that global clearinghouse for plants. It needed a network of satellite botanic gardens spread across Britain's humongous empire. And Banks helped create that network. Colonial botanic gardens were established or revitalized in the West Indies, India, Southeast Asia, Africa, the Pacific. Some of these were run by local administrations, some by the British government, others by the East India Company. But they all had the same basic job: receive plants from Kew, test them, propagate them, and if successful, turn them into economically viable crops. And they worked the other way too, right? These gardens supported local plant collecting and sent seeds and cuttings and specimens back to Kew. And so by 1899, the Kew Bulletin could list 49 botanical departments and establishments across India and the colonies that were officially, quote, in correspondence with Kew. I mean, that is truly an extraordinary legacy.
And many of the people running those places were essentially Banks's proteges, right? Seriously.
Yeah, I mean, and that's actually a really crucial point because during Banks's lifetime, many colonial gardeners or gardens, I should say, came under the control of Kew trained botanists. These were men who owed their careers to Kew, who shared its methods and who remained fiercely loyal to it. Um, they saw themselves as part of a single botanical project, and you can see this especially clearly in the Caribbean. I mean, after Britain acquired islands like Grenada, Dominica, Saint Vincent, Tobago, botanic gardens quickly followed. So St. Vincent's Garden, established just 2 years later, became the first colonial botanic garden. Jamaica's Liguania Botanic Garden followed in 1775. Calcutta's garden in 1786. Cape Town was revitalized under Kew's influence. Peradenia in Ceylon was founded in 1810 with the explicit aim of boosting colonial resources and advancing European botany. Trinidad's garden arrived in 1818. So again, each of these were a node in Banks's system.
Listen, let's they weren't just growing pretty flowers, everyone. Okay?
No, I hope everybody can understand that by now after this whole episode. I mean, these gardens were
After
much more
season
than pretty
6.
flowers. I mean, these gardens were economic laboratories.
Yeah.
Established crops, things like tobacco, bananas, sugar, indigo, coffee. I mean, they were constantly being moved between colonies, tested in new climates, and scaled up for plantation agriculture. But Banks was always on the lookout for the next transformative plant, and nothing illustrates that better than tea patching.
Yeah, because tea is the big one that almost happens on his watch.
Exactly. Tea obsessed Banks. And it obsessed the British government too, actually. So by the 1780s, Britain was hemorrhaging silver to China between 600,000 and 700,000 pounds a year. Because if listeners remember, we did an episode on this a year or two ago. Silver was the only thing Chinese would accept in exchange for tea. So Lord Huxbury, president of the Board of Trade, turned to Banks with a simple but radical question: could tea be grown somewhere within the British Empire? Please let it be true that it can be. And Banks replies in 1788 with a detailed assessment. He points out that tea plants had been grown in British gardens since about 1770, and that he even sent 100 plants to Corsica at his own expense to see if they might thrive there. But Britain itself, he concluded, would never produce tea successfully. Instead, Banks identified Assam as the most promising location. You know, the climates, the terrain, it all seemed right. The real problem, Banks warned, wasn't growing the plants. They could do that. It was processing the leaf. Tea making was a technology as much as an agricultural practice, and the knowledge was jealously guarded in China. So later that year, Banks went further, producing a long scholarly paper on tea cultivation and manufacture for the East India Company, and he even suggested ways of persuading Chinese tea makers to migrate to India and share their expertise.
Yeah, which feels ambitious.
Yeah, just a bit, but, in the end, it didn't happen in his lifetime, right? So the East India Company was just yeah, they're making way too much money from the existing trade to seriously disrupt that, you know? Don't fix what ain't broken.
Right?
So it would take nearly 30 years after Banks's death and the upheaval of the First Opium War for Britain to finally act. And so in 1848, another familiar face on the history of fresh produce, Robert Fortune. If you haven't listened to that series, that's a two-part series I think we did. Robert Fortune was sent to China to steal tea plants and its equipment and expertise, laying the foundations for the Indian tea industry and really the obsession of tea in Britain. And when that happened, it was Banks's blueprint being followed almost to the letter.
Yeah, and so even in failure, he sets the pattern.
Exactly. So
Yeah, after death.
after death, yeah. So by the end of his life, Banks had turned Kew into this, you know, into the world's premier living botanical collection. More than that, he had shown how the global transfer of plants could reshape economies, landscapes, and diets. Fresh produce, cash crops, timber, spices, all flowing through the systems he helped design. And his devotion to Kew, as one contemporary actually put it, was among the greatest services he rendered to his country. And the ramifications of that devotion are still with us, Patrick. I mean, Kew still stands. This global exchange of plants continues. And the gardens we stroll through, often without a second thought, those are all living monuments to Joseph Banks.
Yeah. I mean, which makes him one of those figures who is everywhere, nowhere, all at once, right?
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better
I'm
myself.
just saying.
So, Patrick, I think that's going to wrap up this part of the
Is
story.
it?
This was another long one, but that's just the life of Banks. He is such a fascinating character with such an impact. But we have one more episode to go in this tremendous series. And in that next episode, we'll finally bring the story of Joseph Banks to a close. We'll
Uh-oh.
follow Banks into his final years, how he was viewed at the end of his life, how his reputation rose and fell, and how the modern world remembers him today. So, of course, if you are a member of the History of Fresh Produce Club, our little private network of plant hunters, you can get that episode right now. You can join us and find out the conclusion of Joseph Banks. Of
Yep.
course, if you don't want to join, that's fine. We'll just wait and see you next week. So until then, it's goodbye for me, John Papp.
And goodbye for me, Patrick Kelly.